Last time we spoke about the fall of Iwo Jima. General Schmidt pushed through Japanese defenses, facing strongholds like Cushman's Pocket and General Sanda's positions, with intense fighting and heavy casualties incurred on both sides. Despite stubborn resistance, the Marines gradually advanced, employing tanks and artillery support. The Japanese under Kobayashi fought tenaciously, culminating in a final assault on March 26. After brutal combat, Iwo Jima was declared secured, but it was at a great cost. 18,000 Japanese and over 6,800 American lives were lost. Meanwhile, in New Britain, Australian forces continued their offensive, capturing strategic positions despite fierce enemy resistance. In the midst of the fierce conflict, Australian battalions advanced into enemy territory, capturing strategic positions while facing heavy resistance. Notable victories included the successful ambushes by the 2 and 7th Battalion and the capture of some key locations like the Butt Airfield. Despite facing fierce counterattacks from the Japanese, particularly at Slater's Knoll, the Australians maintained their momentum. And as the Japanese faced internal crisis, the Australians continued their relentless push, ultimately leading to significant territorial gains and the weakening of the Japanese forces. This episode is the Visayas Offensive. Welcome back to the Pacific War Podcast week by week, and I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, the Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all of that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. Over on both of these, I just released a 2-hour-long episode covering the naval battle of Guadalcanal. If you'd like to further support me, please check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Within northern Luzon, by mid-March, General Clarkson's 33rd Division was exploring the western routes to Baguio. Colonel Volkmann's guerrilla unit had taken control of San Fernando and was engaged in combat around Cervantes. Meanwhile, General Mullen's 25th Division had advanced to Putlan, and General Gill's 32nd Division was involved in a fierce battle over Salaksak Pass. Following the capture of Putlan, General Swift instructed Mullins to push through Belit Pass to secure the vital Santa Fe region. On March the 12th, the 27th and 161st Regiments began advancing north and northwest, successfully clearing the Manuli area and establishing a foothold on Norton Ridge by the 15th. At the same time, the 35th Regiment initiated a broader maneuver around Belit Pass via the Old Spanish Road, but this was soon hindered by intense artillery and mortar fire from positions of the 11th Independent Regiment. The road also required significant engineering efforts to support the outflanking force, leading Mullins to ultimately halt the 35th's assault. However, General Kunuma was unaware of this. Fearing an outflanking maneuver from Carignan, he had no choice but to keep around 3,000 of his best troops in the seemingly secure area. On March 15th, Mullins ordered his reinforced 161st Regiment to launch a holding attack to the north, while the majority of the 27th Regiment executed a flanking maneuver over Myoko Ridge, Mount Myoko, and Lone Tree Hill to encircle Belit Pass from the east. After regrouping at Putlan, the 35th was also tasked with the capturing of Mount Kabuto, to subsequently advance northwest along Belit Ridge and to connect with the 27th at Myoko. Mullins launched a renewed offensive on the 16th, facing stubborn resistance from the 161st as it gradually advanced towards Norton's Knob, which was successfully captured by the end of the month. On the 22nd, the 27th began its flanking maneuver, with the 1st Battalion moving east into the elevated terrain south of Capitalan by the 28th, while the 2nd Battalion advanced nearly 3,750 yards up the wooded Myoko Ridge to the east. Meanwhile, the 35th's attempt to encircle the enemy via Kabuto started off pretty well, reaching the northern slope of Belit Ridge on the 22nd. However, Kunuma's recently arrived reinforcements launched a series of strong counterattacks and harassment raids, forcing the 35th to withdraw by March 28th. With the other two regiments stretched thin and unable to penetrate the enemy's main defenses, Mullins ordered the 35th to position itself between the 27th and 161st Regiments to assault Hiley Ridge from the east. By the end of March, the 161st was advancing northeast along Hiley Ridge towards Crump Hill, which finally fell on April the 8th, bringing the advance to a complete halt. The 35th supported this effort with an attack on Capitalan, which was ultimately captured by April the 21st. Meanwhile, the 27th continued to struggle through some challenging terrain to Miyoko Ridge against some fierce opposition, not reaching Woody Hill until about April the 12th. This slow progress allowed Kanuma to reinforce the Miyoko sector with 4 understrength infantry battalions. Nevertheless, the brave soldiers of the 27th Regiment persevered, securing the Pimple on April the 15th and advancing an additional 350 yards northeast by April the 21st. Looking further west, Clarkson aimed to advance battalion combat teams towards Baguio via Route 11, the Galeano Road, and Tuba Trail. However, Swift declined to approve such ambitious plans, limiting the 33rd Division to a more restrained offensive. Although dissatisfied, Clarkson continued the attack along Route 11, managing to reach Camp 3 by the end of March. Within the central area, patrols faced no opposition as they approached within a mile of Galeano. But other patrols discovered increasing signs that the Japanese were preparing to defend the Tuba Trail rather vigorously. Eventually, a robust reconnaissance force secured Luang by March 19th, with patrols then moving east to occupy Nugalan 4 days later and Burgos by the month's end. Meanwhile, at the Salaksak Pass, the 127th Regiment fought from Hill 502 to Hill 504 against some fierce resistance, while Gill sent the 2nd Battalion, 128th Regiment, up the trail from Valdez towards Umagan, where they would ultimately be halted by vigilant Japanese forces. By March 23rd, the 1st Battalion of the 127th Regiment reached the crest of Hill 504. The 2nd Battalion advanced past it to Hill 505, and the 3rd Battalion managed to position one company at the base of Hill 507D. However, with its forces stretched thin and dwindling, the 127th was unable to capitalize on its seemingly advantageous position, allowing General Iwanaka to launch a strong counterattack upon Hill 507D that successfully repelled the 3rd Battalion. As a result, Gilla decided to withdraw that unit and the stalled 2nd Battalion 128th Regiment, while the majority of the 128th relieved the 127th in the Hill 502 sector. Beginning on March the 25th, the 128th Regiment advanced aggressively eastwards, successfully capturing the previously overlooked Hill 503, fully securing Hill 504, and expanding its control over Hill 505 by the month's end. However, on the night of March 31st, Iwanaka launched a very daring counterattack, which would reclaim Hill 504 and nearly take all the territory east of Hill 502. By April the 4th, both the 127th and 128th Regiments had sustained significant casualties and could no longer continue their offensive. Consequently, Swift had ordered the 33rd Division to relieve the beleaguered 126th Regiment in the Ambayabang and Arboreto River valleys, allowing this unit to reposition north of the Villaverde Trail to execute a flanking maneuver along the Millowit River Valley. Fortunately for Clarkson, General Kruger persuaded MacArthur to free the 129th Regiment from its duties in Manila, sending it to bolster the now very overstretched 33rd Division. Once the rest of the 37th Division arrived at the Baguio front, which Kruger anticipated would happen in early April, Swift could now initiate a 2-division assault on Baguio. In the meantime, Clarkson promptly dispatched the 129th to Burgos, and by April the 1st, it had advanced to Salat. The Japanese opposing the reinforced 33rd Division were no longer in the same shape they had been by late February. The 58th IMB and the 23rd Division had both suffered heavy losses during March, losses that probably stemmed largely from a lack of food and medical supplies rather than from actual combat. By mid-March, Japanese supply problems on the Baguio front had progressed from very bad to worse, to impossible. First, supplies had moved westwards over the new Baguio-Aratao supply road far more slowly than anticipated. This was, to a large measure, because of Allied air forces striking that road and along Route 5 north and south of Aratao. Secondly, operations of the 66th Infantry along Route 11 north from Baguio and the activities of the 11th Infantry in general in the Cagayan Valley had made it virtually impossible for the Japanese to bring any food into the Baguio area from the north. Third, the Japanese tried to do too much with the limited amount of supplies available at the Baguio front. They were attempting to supply the 23rd Division and the 58th IMB troops along with the MLR, send CERN military supplies north up Route 11 for the 19th Division, feed the 14th Area Army Headquarters and a large civilian population in Baguio, not to mention establishing supply dumps north and east of the city against the time of eventual withdrawal. Almost inevitably, the principal sufferers were the frontline troops. By mid-March, the best-fed Japanese combat troops at the Baguio front were getting less than half a pound of rice per day, as opposed to the minimum daily requirement of nearly 2.5 pounds. Before the end of the month, the troops of the MLR were down to less than a quarter of a pound of rice per day. Starvation and diet-associated diseases filled hospitals and sapped the strength of the combat units. Generally, effective frontline strength was far lower than reported ration strength indicated. Medical supplies were consumed rapidly. By the end of March, for example, there was virtually no malaria prophylaxis left in the Baguio area hospitals. Looking upon the Baguio front with frank pessimism, Yamashita in mid-March directed inspection of the terrain north, northeast, and east of the city with a view towards preparing a new defensive line. His attitude became even plainer when, on about March the 30th, he ordered Japanese civilians and the Filipino puppet government to evacuate Baguio. Indeed, the future on the Baguio front was so bleak by the end of March that almost any other army would have simply withdrawn to new defensive lines at that moment, thereby saving troops for a future battle. But this was not the case with the Japanese. Yamashita decided that the existing MLR would be held until the situation became completely hopeless. At the end of March, that portion of the MLR held by the 23rd Division was still intact, and the 58th IMB was busy deploying additional strength along its section of the line. One independent infantry battalion was on some high ground north of Route 9 at Sablan. Another held defenses at Sablan. A reinforced company at the Burgos area, less than a company, another independent infantry battalion held reserve positions at Calat, a mile and a half southeast of Sablan. One understrength battalion was responsible for defending the rough terrain from Sablan 6 miles south to Mount Apni, where there was a tie-in made with the right flank of the 23rd Division. Major General Bonzo Seto, commanding the 58th IMB, expected that the emphasis of any Allied drive in the sector would come along Route 9, but he did not neglect the other approaches to the area, such as the Galiano Road. Since the understrength battalion stationed astride the road was not strong enough to withstand a concerted attack, he directed his main reserve force, the 1st Battalion of the 75th Infantry 19th Division, to move west out of Baguio to the defenses at Atsin. This step left the Baguio a reserve force of roughly 3 provisional infantry battalions, which together probably could muster no more than 750 effectives. Within the Salaksak area, as casualties in the Western Pass were rapidly increasing, and Allied artillery and aerial strikes made it nearly impossible for the 2nd Division to transport supplies, Iwanaka concluded that his forward positions were nearly unattainable. He began planning to redeploy his forces to defend the Eastern Pass. Consequently, when the 126th Regiment launched its new offensive on April the 5th, it faced unexpectedly light resistance, quickly capturing Hills 518 and 519 within just 2 days, and cutting off a Japanese supply route leading north from Hill 504, across the eastern slopes of Hills 519 and Mount Imugan. However, Iwanaka swiftly recognized the emerging threats, and he sent reinforcements to intercept the 126th advance, delaying the capture of Hills 511 and 512 until March the 13th, and effectively halting further progress. At the same time, the reorganized 128th Regiment resumed its assault eastwards on April the 7th, successfully retaking Hills 504 and 505, then capturing Hill 506 by April the 10th. The following week, the 128th fought tenaciously to secure this elevated ground against fierce resistance, managing to push all the way up to Hills 506B, 507C, and 507D, with the remaining strength, nearly securing the western passes by April the 17th. Meanwhile, after the fall of San Fernando, General Kruger instructed Volkmann to advance inland along Route 4 towards Montauk. However, the provisional battalion established at Cervantes could not withstand the relentless enemy pressure until about April the 4th, when it was ultimately forced to retreat into the hills northwest of the town. Consequently, Volkmann had to quickly deploy the 121st Regiment to the Barrio Butak in preparation for an eastward push along Route Number 4. After a week of intense back-and-forth combat, this elite guerrilla unit succeeded in establishing footholds along the northern parts of Namagan and Yubo ridges. Over the next few days, the 121st made slow and arduous progress, ultimately gaining control of Route 4 nearly to the southern-eastern edge of the Basang Pass by mid-April. Further south, by mid-March, General Wing's 43rd Division had effectively secured the Antipolo sector, while General Hurtis' 6th Division was advancing well towards Mount Bayatigan. At this point, General Hall's 11th Corps assumed responsibility for operations against the Shimbo Group, now rebranded as the 41st Army. However, he quickly decided to maintain the offensive against General Yokoyama's left flank, with the 20th and 1st Regiments focused on an eastward push alongside the 43rd Division. Meanwhile, General Noguchi had completed his withdrawal to the Sugarloaf Hill Mount Taillon line, where he would receive reinforcements from elements of the Kogurt detachment. Simultaneously, General Kobayashi was struggling to stabilize his left flank, bolstered by one reserve battalion. On the morning of March the 15th, the American offensive resumed, with the 103rd Regiment continuing its assaults on Benchmark 7 Hill to secure Route 60A, while the 172nd Regiment launched its initial attacks towards Sugarloaf Hill, facing some fierce resistance. On March the 17th, the 1st Regiment renewed its advance towards Bayatigan, initially making some good progress and digging in about a mile west-southwest of the mountain summit. However, during the night, a barrage of mortar fire, followed by infantry counterattacks, forced the Americans to retreat in disarray. As a result of this setback, the 1st Division began its advance eastwards more cautiously, facing determined resistance and heavy mortar fire. By March 22nd, it was only slightly closer to Bayatigan's crest than it had been 5 days earlier. The 20th Regiment on the left also encountered strong resistance, managing to reach a point a mile and a half west of Bayatigan by March 22nd. At the same time, a company maneuvering to the north established a foothold on some wooded ridge overlooking the Bosa Bosa Valley. Meanwhile, the 103rd Infantry finally overran the defenses at Benchmark 7 on March 18th, killing about 250 Japanese in the process. The Japanese battalion there had delayed the 103rd's attack towards Mount Taillon until the morning of the 18th, but by the evening that day the regiment's troops had begun swarming up the bare, rocky, and southern and southwestern slopes of the mountain. Over the next 3 days, American forces slowly advanced through a complex of caves and bunkers until they secured the mountain summit, while others captured Benchmark 23 Hill and patrolled northward into the southeastern part of the Bosa Bosa Valley. By the 19th, the 172nd Division was completely halted, containing Sugarloaf to the west. They bypassed it north and east, initiating some new assaults towards Mounts Tabang and Kaimayuman, making significant progress to the east but less so to the north by the 22nd. Despite some concerns that Hall's 4 exhausted regiments might lack the strength to turn the 41st Army's left flank, the ongoing pressure and the failure of the previous counterattacks ultimately compelled Yokoyama to order his threatened units to withdraw to new positions east of the Bosa Bosa River. Therefore, when the 6th and 43rd Divisions resumed their attacks on the morning of March 23rd, the withdrawal was already in full progress. Over the next 3 days, the 1st and 20th Regiments faced only scattered and disorganized resistance, allowing them to establish positions over a mile north and south of Bayatigan, along the ridgeline that overlooks the Bosa Bosa Valley. Meanwhile, the 172nd Regiment successfully captured Mount Tabang and most of Mount Kaimayuman, while the 103rd Regiment advanced quickly northwards, taking the barrio of New Boso Boso, Mount Bayatigan, and Benchmark 21 Hill. On the 27th, the 1st Regiment secured the crest of Bayatigan, and the 172nd Regiment eliminated the last organized opposition on Sugarloaf Hill. With Yokoyama's left flank now collapsing, Hall could focus on capturing Wawa Dam and destroying the remaining elements of the Kobayashi force west of the Boso Bosa River, a mission assigned to the 6th Division. During this initial offensive, approximately 7,000 Japanese soldiers were killed since February the 20th, while American casualties included 435 killed, 1,425 wounded. Curtis' initial strategy for capturing Wawa Dam involved the 1st and 20th Regiments advancing northwards to clear the Woodpecker Ridge and Mount Mataba, while the 63rd Regiment conducted diversionary attacks on the western slopes of Mataba. This new offensive began on March 28th, but quickly faced intense small arms, machine gun, and mortar fire, leading to some back-and-forth struggle against some fierce enemy resistance. By April 3rd, the 20th Regiment had advanced less than half a mile towards Mataba, and the 1st Regiment had gained only 250 yards to the north. General Curtis had hoped his attack directed against the Kobayashi force's southern flank would be far more successful, but Kobayashi's force rapidly and efficiently had reoriented its defenses, which it had laid out primarily to face the attack from the west. The force's 2 remaining provisional infantry regiments, the Central and Right Sector units, were still relatively intact, and the Central Sector unit, bearing the brunt of the 6th Division's offensive, had recently been reinforced by remnants of the Left Sector's unit and elements of the Shimbo Group Reserve. Other factors bearing on the 6th Division's slow progress were the declining strength and the deteriorating combat efficiency of its infantry regiments. The 20th Infantry could muster only 2,085 effectives on April 3rd. Some of its rifle companies were reduced to a combat strength of just platoons. The situation within the 1st Infantry, with an effective strength of 2,150, was little better. As of the 3rd of April, the commanders of both regiments rated their units' combat efficiency as only fair, the lowest ranking of 3 terms each had employed since the Ligayen Gulf assault. To bolster protection for Hirsch's right flank, the 103rd Regiment had also captured Hill 1200 on the east bank of the Bosa Bosa River by the end of the month. Due to slow progress of Hirsch's offensive, on April the 5th, Hall assigned General Cunningham's Baldy Force, which consisted of the 112th Cavalry Regiment and the recently arrived 169th Regiment, to take control of the area north of Mount Oro. This move would free up most of the 63rd Regiment to support the 20th Regiment and continue the assault north towards Mataba, while the 1st Regiment maintained its position along Woodpecker Ridge. From April the 6th to the 9th, the 63rd made only limited progress to the east. However, on April the 10th, it shifted its focus to an offensive on the western slopes of Mataba, quickly securing the southwestern quarter of the mountain with minimal resistance. In response, Kobayashi promptly redirected his forces back to Mataba from the north-south bridge to prevent the 63rd from reaching the mountain summit until April the 17th. At the same time, the 1st Regiment resumed its advance along Woodpecker Ridge, but again faced strong enemy opposition, resulting in only limited gains. Looking even further south, by March 23rd, the 187th Glider Regiment and the 511th Parachute Regiment had advanced to Santo Tomas and Taillon, but were unable to completely clear these areas. Meanwhile, the 158th Regiment secured Balayan, Batangas, and Colopan Peninsula, pushing towards Mount Bacolod, where they were ultimately halted by significant forces from the Fuji Force. At this stage, as Kruger planned to launch an offensive into the Bicol Peninsula using the 158th, he needed to relieve the 11th Airborne Division with the barely rested 1st Cavalry Division. This division quickly took control of the Santo Tomas Taillon area, while General Swing's units maneuvered around the west side of Lake Tal to relieve the 158th at Macolod. As a result, General Griswold renewed his offensive on March 24th. The 187th attempted to attack Macolod but was unsuccessful. A task force composed of units from Swing's other 2 regiments advanced quickly north towards Lipa, only to be halted in the hills southeast of the town. The 8th Cavalry captured Santo Tomas after a fierce battle and took Taillon 2 days later. The 7th Cavalry advanced about 5 miles east into the corridor between Mounts Maquiling and Malpuño, while the 12th Cavalry pushed along Route 21, moving about 4 miles beyond Los Banos. The 27th Swing's task force finally overcame the enemy defenses southeast of Lipa, but it was the 8th Cavalry that ultimately secured the strategic town 2 days later. Griswold's successful offensive also forced around 2,000 troops from the Fuji Force to retreat along Route 21 and through the Santa Maria Valley to join Yokoyama's forces in the mountains east of Manila. In response, Kruger devised a plan to prevent the potential influx of Japanese reinforcements around the eastern and northern shores of Laguna de Bay. He instructed Hall to clear the northern shore of the lake, block the Santa Maria Valley, and secure Route 21. While the 187th continued its assault on Macolod, Griswold ordered his other units to push eastwards to secure Laguna de Bay and Tayaspa Bay. Accordingly, on March 30th, the 103rd Regiment advanced in small increments along the northern shore of Laguna de Bay, reaching Sinaloa by April 4th. The 12th Cavalry moved to Calian and then south along a secondary road towards San Pablo, encountering strong enemy positions that wouldn't be overcome until April 5th. The 5th and 7th Cavalry Regiments fought through the Macoling-Malipuño corridor against determined but disorganized Japanese resistance, successfully occupying San Pablo by April 2nd. Additionally, elements of the 188th Glider Regiment pushed east towards the mountains corridor, reaching Taung by April 3rd and Lucena 3 days later. By April 6th, the 5th Cavalry and the 103rd Regiment had established contact at Pagsanjan, effectively isolating the 41st Army. The next day, patrols from the 11th Airborne Division headed north from Lucena, while 1st Cavalry Division patrols departed from Pagsanjan, heading south. They successfully linked up at Lucban by April 10th, and then they advanced eastwards to Maban. At the same time, a company from the 188th traveled along Route Number 1 across the Bondoc Isthmus, reaching Atamanan on April 11th. Griswold's patrols also moved towards Mount Malipuño, where the Fuji Force was preparing for their final stand. By April 16th, preliminary assaults had concentrated enemy resistance around the Mount Matasna-Bondoc area. Meanwhile, after a week of intense aerial bombardment, Brigadier General Hanford McNitter's 158th Regiment successfully landed at Legazpi Port with minimal opposition on April 1st. They quickly secured the port and the nearby airfield, then advanced to Taraga before moving south along Route Number 1 to occupy the Sorsogon Peninsula, where they encountered machine gun fire from the Mount Baraway Busay Ridge. The following morning, the troops had to retreat east of Daraga, and in the coming days, the 158th faced tough fighting in the challenging jungle terrain to overcome resistance in the Daraga area. Concerned about delays in occupying the Sorsogon Peninsula, McNitter landed his anti-tank company at Bacon on April 6th, which occupied Sorsogon without any opposition. Meanwhile, the 2nd Battalion continued its overland advance, reaching Bulan by April 12th, where they targeted a significant Japanese concentration. Simultaneously, McNitter's other 2 battalions attacked Kamalig on April 11th, and then they began an unsuccessful assault upon the enemy positions in the Kitinan Hills. By April 1st, the 188th had successfully eliminated the last organized resistance in the rugged hills south of Ternat. Meanwhile, the 2nd Battalion of the 151st Regiment launched an assault on Caballo Island on March 27th, but could not fully dismantle the entrenched enemy positions until April 13th. The Japanese in the pits and tunnels created an almost insolvable problem for the 2nd Battalion, 151st Infantry. The Japanese had so well in place their weapons, which included machine guns and motors, that they controlled all approaches to the motor pits, but could not be reached by American artillery or motor fire. When the 151st Infantry concentrated its motor fire against the pit's entrances, the Japanese simply withdrew into the tunnels. When the American fire ceased, at the last possible moment before an infantry assault, the Japanese would rush out of the tunnels to man their weapons. Tanks were of no help to the American troops. From positions near the rim of the pits, and the tanks were unable to depress their guns sufficiently to do much damage to the Japanese. If the tanks tried to approach from above, they started sliding downhill to 2 slopes into the pits. No combination of tank, artillery, and infantry action proved to any avail, and the 151st Infantry had to give up its attempts to take the Japanese positions by assault. On March 31st, engineers tried to pour some diesel oil into some of the tunnels connecting the motor pits, employing for this purpose a single ventilator shaft that was accessible to the 151st Infantry. Nothing came of the effort, since it was impossible to get enough oil up the steep slopes of the hill to create a conflagration of significant proportions within the tunnels. Nevertheless, burning the Japanese out seemed to promise the only method of attack that would not risk the unduly heavy casualties of a direct infantry assault. No one, of course, wanted to throw away the lives of experienced troops on such an insignificant objective. Finally, the commander of the 113th Engineers, 38th Division, suggested pumping oil up the hill from the beach through a pipeline from a ship or landing craft anchored at the shoreline. The Allied naval forces happily fell in with this idea, and they supplied the 151st with 2 oil-filled pontoon cubes. The Allied Air Forces provided a 110 horsepower pump and necessary lengths of pipeline and flexible hosing, and the 592nd Engineer Boat and Shore Regiment came through with a LCM to carry the pump and the pontoon cubes. On April 5th, over 2,500 gallons of diesel fuel were pumped into the pits and tunnels through the ventilator, and they were ignited by white phosphorus motor shells. The results, as the 38th Division reported, were most gratifying. A huge flash fire ensued, followed by a general conflagration and several explosions. The engineers repeated the process on the 6th and 7th of April, and later that day carefully lowered 2 large demolition charges through the ventilator shaft and placed another at an accessible tunnel. Set off simultaneously, the 3 charges caused an enormous volume of flames and several terrific explosions. For the next few days, the 2nd Battalion 151st tried to persuade a few Japanese who had lived through the Holocaust to surrender and also execute a few infantry probing attacks. On April 13th, a patrol entered the pits and tunnels, killed the lone surviving Japanese, and reported the positions cleared and secured. Following this, El Fraile was targeted, with Company F of the 151st and the 113th Engineers effectively neutralizing Fort Drum using the gasoline explosives. On the 16th, troops from the 1st Battalion of the 151st attacked Carabao Island, facing no opposition. Now, taking a look at the Visayas, after capturing Palawan and Zamboanga, General Eichelberger set his sights on the Sulu Archipelago, where new airfields were being established. On March 16th, a reinforced company from the 162nd Regiment landed unopposed on Basilan Island and spent the next 2 days searching Basilan and the nearby inlets, finding no signs of Japanese horses. On April 2nd, the reinforced 2nd Battalion of the 163rd Regiment landed on Sanga Sanga Island, successfully clearing Taui Taui Group by April 6th. The remainder of the regiment made an unopposed landing near Jolo Town on April 9th. Over the next 2 days, the Americans drove approximately 2,400 men of the 55th Independent Mixed Brigade from the heights immediately south and southeast of the town to secure a nearby airstrip. However, the Japanese retreated to more fortified hill masses further inland, where they had long prepared their defenses, and they began to resist fiercely. After initial attacks by Colonel Alejandro Sarez's guerrillas failed to breach the Japanese positions, the 1st Battalion of the 163rd joined the fight and managed to overrun the enemy defenses by April the 22nd. On April the 25th, the 3rd Battalion launched an assault on Lieutenant General Suzuki Tetsuo's final positions on Mount Tumatangus, which were ultimately subdued by May the 2nd. However, the remaining Japanese forces continued to engage in guerrilla warfare. By this time, airfields in Zamboanga and Sangasenga had become operational to support the forthcoming invasion of Borneo. The first field at Zamboanga was a dry weather strip 5,000 feet long, completed on March 15th and immediately put to use by the Marine Corps planes. The field, named Calorian-Drome, could not answer the need for the all-weather strip 6,000 feet long. Accordingly, engineers constructed a new strip which the Marine aviators based there called Moret Field, about a mile to the east, and they had it ready for all-weather operations by May the 16th. Used primarily by the Marine Air Groups 12, 24, and 32, Moret Field was also employed by the 13th Air Force Night Fighter Squadron, an emergency rescue squadron, and 13th Air Force B-24s and P-38s staging through strikes against Borneo. Marine Corps planes on March 16th executed the first supported mission flown from the field in the Zamboanga area, covering the landing on Basilan Island. Later, Marine Corps planes from Zamboanga flew support for the Tawi-Tawi and Jolo operations, and they undertook pre-assault bombardment and cover for the invasion of eastern Mindanao. While 13th Air Force planes executed most of the support for the invasion of Borneo, Marine Corps B-25s from Zamboanga also flew some missions. At Sangasenga Island, there was a Japanese coral surface strip about 2,800 feet long. Engineers repaired and extended this strip to a length of 5,000 feet by May the 2nd, when fighters of the 13th Air Force began moving to Sangasenga from Palawan to provide close support for the initial landings on Borneo. These U.S. Army planes were replaced in mid-May by units of the Royal Australian Air Force, which employed the all-weather Sangasenga field during later operations on Borneo. Finally, a Japanese field 3,800 feet long on Jolo Island was repaired and used for aerial supply and evacuation operations in support of ground troops throughout the Sulu archipelago. Eichelberger's next target was the Central Visayan Islands. For the Panay Guimaras Northern Negros operation, codenamed Victor I, he assigned General Brush's 40th Division, excluding the 108th Regiment, which had recently been assigned to Leyte. The 40th Division departed Ligian Gulf on March 15th aboard ships from Admiral Struvel's Task Group 38.3. After a brief stop at Mindoro, they arrived at Panay before dawn on March 18th. Following a short bombardment by destroyers, the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 185th Regiment landed unopposed about 12 miles west of Iloilo, where they were joined by Colonel Maciero Pelata's guerrillas, who already controlled much of the island at this point. The 185th quickly expanded its beachhead against light and scattered resistance and then began advancing along the coastal road towards Iloilo in the afternoon, forcing the 170th Independent Battalion to retreat to the mountainous interior. With Iloilo secured by March 20th, G Company of the 185th successfully captured Inampulagan Island on March 22nd, while other elements of the regiment cleared the unoccupied Guimaras Island by the 23rd. Additionally, Brush decided to assign the 2nd Battalion of the 160th Regiment to garrison Panay alongside Peralta's guerrillas. No pursuit of the 170th Independent Battalion was made, allowing the Japanese to continue their guerrilla activities until the very end of the war. Meanwhile, for the operation against the Northern Negros, Brush planned to launch an assault while the 185th Regiment on March 29th followed by the majority of the 160th Regiment the next day, while keeping the 503rd Parachute Regiment in reserve for potential airdrops. Opposing him, Lieutenant General Kono Tagishi's 77th Brigade had a total of 15,000 troops, but was prepared to retreat into the mountains of the north-central Negros for a prolonged defense, leaving only token forces in the coastal plain to delay American advances. On March 29th, the 185th Regiment landed unopposed near Pulapadan and quickly secured a bridge over the Baguio River. The 85th then spread north and east, with the 160th Regiment following successfully, securing nearly the entire coastal plain of northwestern Negros by noon of April 2nd. As they closed in Kanono's inner fortress, the Americans overran the main Japanese outpost, with the 511th landing to bolster the assault. On April 9th, Brush launched his general offensive, with his 3 regiments advancing slowly into rugged terrain, where the Japanese held significant defensive advantages. On June 4th, General Kono realized that his remaining forces were incapable of further sustaining effort, directing a general withdrawal deep into the mountains behind his broken defensive lines. The surviving Japanese dispersed into small groups, seeking food in hideouts and trying to avoid contact with Colonel Absede's guerrillas, who, under the direction of the 503rd Parachute Regiment, took over responsibility for the pursuit of Kono's men. On June the 9th, the 503rd then relieved all elements of the 4th Division in northern Negros. By that date, the Japanese had lost well over 4,000 men. Kono would lose another 3,350 troops, mainly from starvation and disease, before the end of the war. After the general surrender in August of 1945, over 6,150 Japanese came down from the mountains to turn themselves in, joining about 350 others who had been captured earlier. In all, about 7,100 Japanese lost their lives in northern Negros, pinned down, the equivalent of an American infantry division, for over 2 months. The 40th Division's casualties for the operation included those of the attached 503rd Parachute, totaling approximately 370 men killed and 1,035 wounded. Meanwhile, Ekeberg's final objective in the central Visayas was Cebu, assigned to Major General William Arnold's Americal Division. For Operation Victor II, Captain Albert Sprague's Task Group 78.2 was set to land the bulk of the division at Cebu City, while Colonel James Cushing's guerrillas secured the water sources. Opposing them were Rear Admiral Harada Keiku's 33rd Naval Special Base Force and Major General Majome Takio's 78th Brigade, which together comprised approximately 14,500 troops, including the 173rd Independent Battalion and the 36th Naval Guard Unit stationed at Cebu City. Additionally, around 750 soldiers from General Katioka's 1st Division were positioned in northern Cebu. Although the command situation on the island was very chaotic, General Suzuki's 35th Army headquarters in Leyte had been evacuated by 2 large motorized landing barges between the 17th and the 25th. Taking control of all the forces on Cebu, Suzuki appointed Majome as the de jure commander at Cebu City, while leaving Katioka in charge of northern Cebu as he prepared to retreat to Mindanao. General Majome designed his defenses so as to control, not hold, the coastal plains around Cebu City, and for this purpose he set up defenses in depth north and northwest of the city. A forward line constituting an outpost line of resistance stretching across the first rising ground behind the city hills 2.5 to 4 miles inland. A stronger and shorter second line, the main line of the resistance, lay about a mile farther inland and generally 350 feet higher into the hills. Back of this MLR were Majome's last stand defenses, centered in rough, broken hills 5 miles or so north of the city. Anticipating that American forces would attempt to mount wide envelopments of his defensive lines, Majome set up one flank protective strongpoint in the rugged bare hills about 3.5 miles north of the barrio of Telasay, on the coast about 6 miles southwest of Cebu City, to block the valley of the Mananga River, a natural axis of advance for the forces enveloping from the south and the west. Similarly, he established strongpoints on his left to block the valley of the Batuanon River, roughly 4 miles northeast of Cebu City. Against this eventuality that the American invading forces might land north of Cebu City and strike into the Batuanon Valley, Majome set up another flank protection position in low hills overlooking the beach at Le Leon. This is about 10 miles southeast of Cebu City. Majome did not intend to hold the beaches, but at both Telasay and Le Leon, the best landing points in the Cebu City region, he thoroughly mined all logical landing areas. The Japanese also constructed tank barriers along the shoreline and planted tank traps and minefields along all the roads leading inland towards Cebu City. The inner defensive lines were a system of mutually supporting machine gun positions in caves, pillboxes, and bunkers. Many of these positions had been completed for months and had acquired natural camouflage. Majome's troops had an ample supply of machine guns and machine cannon, and like the Japanese on Negros, employed remounted aircraft and anti-aircraft weapons. Majome had some light and heavy motors, but only a few pieces of light artillery. For the rest, however, Majome's forces were far better supplied than Kono's troops had been in northern Negros. After an uneventful journey, Task Group 78.2 and the Americal Division arrived off Cebu in the early hours of March 26th. Following an hour of bombardment by 3 light cruisers and 6 destroyers from Admiral Berkey's Task Force 74, the leading waves of the 132nd and 182nd Regiments landed unopposed on the beaches just north of Telasay at 8:30. However, the landing was chaotic as Japanese mines just a few yards beyond the surf line disabled 10 of the first 15 LVTs. Fortunately for the Americans, Majome had chosen to withdraw from the beaches to establish inland defenses, resulting in minimal casualties. Once they cleared the beach minefields by about 10 a.m., Arnold's leading units cautiously advanced through the abandoned defenses towards the main highway to Cebu City, ultimately stopping for the night about a mile and a half south of their objective. The following day, the infantry secured Cebu City without any opposition, and on March 28th they proceeded to clear Lahug Airfield and Hill 30 to the north. The Americans began their assault on Gochan Hill on March 29th, during which Company A of the 182nd was completely annihilated by the explosion of an ammunition dump located in the caves along the hill's eastern spur. Fueled by a desire for revenge, nearly the entire 182nd returned to attack on March 30th and successfully captured Gochan Hill. Meanwhile, the 132nd Regiment cleared the coastal plains area north of the Batuanon River, further securing the city's water supply sources by April 2nd. Unopposed troops from the 132nd also successfully landed on Mactan Island, quickly securing an airstrip there. In the meantime, as guerrillas had already taken control of much of Masbate, the 2nd Battalion of the 108th Regiment successfully landed on the island by April 7th. Facing minimal opposition, the Americans pursued the scattered Japanese remnants through the hills and jungles of Masbate, killing approximately 120 Japanese soldiers by May the 4th. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And hey, after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. Over on both of these, I just dropped a new episode. It's a 2-hour episode on the naval battle of Guadalcanal, very thoroughly done with my co-host Garav. And if you'd like to further support me, please check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/PacificWarChannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all of the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. And I will state this here as I just finished writing it up. I had asked my patrons quite a while back in a poll if they'd be up for a new series, a alternate history series of the Pacific War. Now, this series is not going to be how Japan could have won World War II or anything like that. It's honestly thoroughly researched, and it's going to be as logical as possible. But to tease you all, so you'll go over to my Patreon, the name of the first episode is The Great Naval Battle of Pearl Harbor. I hope it's enticing to you because I put a ton of effort into it, and I am very excited for unleashing it soon. On March 29th, the Americans attacked Gochan Hill, suffering heavy losses. Seeking revenge, they captured it the very next day, securing water supplies and defeating Japanese forces in Masbate. Throughout April, Allied forces advanced strategically, overcoming fierce Japanese resistance, securing key positions and establishing more and more airfields, culminating in significant victories all across the Philippines.